We're now going to shift focus to talk about the 10 different sex therapy concepts that I believe are foundational and essential to the work that I do in sex therapy. Some of these you will not recognize as traditional sex therapy concepts. That's okay. That's how I try to integrate some more experiential, present process models, as well as really just trying to find ways to meet the client's needs. And these are some of the issues that really need to be discussed. So some of the more traditional sex therapy concepts like the dual control model, human sexual response model, and the sexual response cycle. Closeness and separateness is an essential concept for me that comes out of Esther Perel's work. Defining good sex. So first of all, defining sex and then defining good and what actually does good sex mean for clients. Trauma-informed treatment. Obviously, we need to have that to help with some of the sexual trauma or some of the shame that has been produced in clients. Attachment theory is one that I use in sex therapy because I've seen how powerful attachment theory work can be in EFT. And having said that, the EFT cycle. This is how I bring a more systemic lens into sex therapy as well, is by using the communication patterns and the systemic nature of communication to help couples or even individuals make some changes that they need. Love maps and arousal templates. So that's another important component around building towards an understanding of what do we want. We might know what we don't want sexually, but how do we understand what we do want? What are we trying to get towards? And then consent, obviously being a foundational concept for all of sex therapy, but actually, I think underutilized, especially as it comes up with heteronormative couples where there is a patriarchal component in that. I think that consent becomes a very, very important part of that therapeutic process, because the understanding of consent from a patriarchal lens is different than how we understand authentic or more enthusiastic consent. So let's start with Masters and Johnson's model. So this is all the way back to the 60s. Some of the first researchers of sex, Alfred Kinsey, I think, was a bigger researcher in the 50s, but Masters and Johnson did a little bit more therapeutic work, whereas Kinsey was trying to assess what does the sex lives of individuals look like, what are some of the demographic factors, a little bit more with Kinsey. So Masters and Johnson came along in the 60s. Masters was a trained physician and researcher, and he ended up marrying Johnson, who started out there like as a receptionist. They have a very interesting history. If you ever want to watch the show Masters of Sex, that was on Showtime a few years ago, and it chronicles Masters and Johnson's relationship as it evolved over the years. So there's some patriarchal influences just on the 60s and how this was organized with the physician and the helper being gendered. So this is what they came up with. They said this is how the human sexual response is supposed to look when everything's going well. You're supposed to have desire, and how they term that is you're supposed to have kind of a spontaneous desire from time to time, that it's just supposed to kind of appear somewhere, basically out of thin air, according to this model. So everybody gets desire, and then they go into an arousal state. So that would be, erections, or vasodilation, blood flow changes in the body, to set up physiological states of arousal, which then move into orgasm. 1, 2, 3, however many you can have, and then back down to you need a recovery period after that. So desire, arousal, orgasm, refractory period, that's the Masters and Johnson model. So there's nothing here about context. There's nothing here about if you're not feeling well, or if you had a stressful day, should you still have this same process of moving smoothly from desire into arousal? And another big one is the context in which desire exists can be very different. So this model does not talk about context enough. It's a very intrapsychic process of something that's just happening within an individual, which makes a lot of sense given that it really comes from a medical model. It is trying to look at what is normal, and then try and get people to conform to this pathway as the standard path for sexuality. When the research is conducted on it, it does seem to fit a lot of men. So there does seem to be a fit for about 2/3 of men. And in this regard, that means that men are more likely to have spontaneous desire. That's usually what the difference is, that more men have spontaneous desire than responsive desire. And so that doesn't always seem to translate in the research for females. They don't consistently have the same kind of spontaneous desire. It's a bit more responsive. So that's the Masters and Johnson model. It can be used effectively, but it can also really be used more effectively by contrasting it to the other model that is the circular model from Rosemary Besson. And she came out with this in 2000. She's a female Canadian researcher out of Ottawa. So her big change was to make it cyclical instead of linear or stepwise. And that changed it because it meant that that the sexual feelings or behaviors don't have to go in a certain order. So you don't have to have desire first before you get aroused. You could have sexual arousal that actually stimulates desire, or you could have an orgasm that actually stimulates desire. So it's much more cyclical. Well, it is cyclical, obviously, compared to the Masters and Johnson, very linear stepwise. So that's a major improvement, especially in terms of for female sexuality. The other one is that this is really all about context. So what's the context in which I may experience desire? Well, I may need a very emotional and physically satisfying relationship, which makes me feel more emotionally intimate about the person and gives a receptivity towards sexual cues. So not the spontaneity of advancing with spontaneous desire, but that there's a receptivity. So it's like that maybe has to be met first sometimes, is that I'm just receptive towards sexual cues, or I am not receptive towards sexual cues. And what's the difference in context? So how do I know when I am in this neutral sexual space where I could be receptive to sexual cues? And how do I know what factors go into when I am not in a receptive space for sexual cues? And that's part of building the context of understanding one's own sexuality and then being able to communicate that with the partner. We don't know immediately which model we're going to fit into. We have to think about it. We have to look at what our body is telling us. and through experience understand what process our unique body goes through in order to have spontaneous desire or to get to a place of sexual neutrality where there is some receptiveness towards it. Of course, neutrality doesn't mean anything except there's receptivity. So it doesn't mean that it's always going to work. There still has to be specific sexual stimuli that actually fit for that person with what they want and how that helps them to turn on in terms of a desire or an arousal state. So these two models, I think that when I talk about them, I always talk about both of them at the same time. I talk about this is the Masters and Johnson model of it. It fits 2/3 of men. So, you know, maybe it's more likely that in a heteronormative relationship, the male might have that, but we don't want to assume that. And then we talk about the circular model. So we add in context, which is very important because context being vital in terms of receptivity to any sexual cues. So being able to understand the context of that. So I talk about both of them with couples, and then we're able to assess, well, how do you think maybe being in a different sexual response pathway, how do you think that might impact your guys' sex lives? How do you make this fit together when you have different kind of ways of being sexually or different ways of getting turned on, or how you go into desire, or maybe you go into arousal first and then desire? So we need to be able to talk about this with clients. The next model to look at is the dual control model. So the newer stuff is from Michael Perlman, but originally the dual control model was done by John Bancroft. And so Michael Perlman has just taken over that line of research. And the dual control model is basically, you have two sides on like a teeter-totter or a weigh scale, let's say. So on one side is everything that turns you on, all of your accelerators, all of the things that you might desire. And on the other side, you have all of the things that turn you off. So the things that you do not like, things you do not want to do. And depending on where that balance is between the turn-ons and the turn-offs, or the accelerators and the brakes, you're going to either tip towards sexuality if there's more accelerators than brakes, or if there's more brakes than accelerators, the couple or the individual is not going to tip into a sexual space. So this is a way of helping clients understand how they can understand their turn on and turn offs better. So we want them to talk just as much about what might turn them on as to what might turn them off. And it's so easy for clients and couples to come in and talk about all of their turn offs and the reason they don't want to have sex and why sex hasn't been good and yada, yada. And really, we need to make sure that we're helping them also focus on what they actually want. Nobody's going to have more sex by just talking about what they don't like about sex. So we need to make sure that we are attending to the accelerators. What do you want to move towards? What would that look like? What components go into the turn on? So of the five senses, you know, what visually is a turn on and what's a turn off? What about auditory? Turn on with dirty talk or with some romantic music or not. And we can go through the five senses. Because the dual control model is attempting to incorporate both physiological and psychological factors into the model. So usually with the brakes, stress, feeling pressure are huge turnoffs. And so physiologically that manifests as like a stress reaction, or perhaps even a trauma reaction, and also from a so physiological and psychological, meaning some of the desires, the fantasies that individuals have. So we want to be able to talk about all of those issues with clients, their physiology, the psychology, the cultural impacts of what turns them on and what doesn't, or maybe even how they learned what turned them off and what didn't. So we'd be trying to help couples or individuals really explore, what are all of my accelerators? What's the context in which those accelerators really land and work well for me? What's all of my turn-offs, the things that I will not entertain or actually push me away from sexuality? And let's start to learn about ourselves. So we need to learn about ourselves first, about what we like, what we don't like, and then we need to be able to communicate that to our partner. So the dual control model is very important. You'll see a number of techniques that I use in the solutions section that is really based on the dual control model. The next one is closeness and separateness. And this is also, I think, an example of a dual control model where there's two different processes that are happening at the same time. And what matters is where they're balanced at. So for some people, they want a lot of closeness in their relationship. That's how they feel very, very safe. They don't like a lot of separateness or independence. So they have a certain balance. And then their partner might have a very different balance. Maybe they're a lot more independent. They like to be separate a little bit more. And closeness is not as big of a component either for the relationship in general or for how they get to a sexual place. So I'm going to let Esther Perel talk a little bit more about this concept about closeness and separateness.
Oh, you made a great point in your TED Talk where you said when you're looking at your partner very close, it's hard to get that, that desire. But when you're doing it kind of at an arm's length, where you're watching them do something well or watching them interact with others, you can kind of rekindle the mystery about them. Did I understand that right?
See, I was always saying that desire needs space.
That's an interesting concept.
Yes, desire needs space, difference, otherness, a bridge to cross, somebody to conquer, to bring toward you, a tension, but I could never concretize it, like it's an abstract concept. So I began to ask people in 22 countries, when do you find yourself most drawn to your partner? Not just sexually attracted, drawn to your partner. And I began to listen to the answers. This took a few years of my asking this in Turkey, in Argentina, in Israel, in Brussels, in Paris, in New York, And then I began to see that a certain group of answers would appear each time. A whole set of answers had to do with when my partner is on stage, when he's passionate about things, when she's competent, when they're thriving, when they are radiant, was really the word that would, the word isn't used, but that's what it represented. Their radiance can be because they are good at something, because they're in their element, because they're being admired. Admiration is the piece here, more than respect. And all of these were when I actually, involve otherness. When I look at my partner doing the things that they are so good at, if my partner is at the piano, I'm not sitting next to them. If they're on stage, I'm not next to them. The only one that is gender specific is when he plays with the children. There is no female version of that. Nobody thinks it's sexy if she plays with the kids.
No?
Okay? No, because it's... So when I see my partner in their uniqueness, in their specificity, in their element, by definition invites a perspective and an ability to see their otherness. When we are away, that was group number 2. When we are away, when I'm away, when he's away, when she's away, when we reunite, always brought the notion that desire is rooted in absence and in longing. When she makes me laugh, when he's dressed a certain way, when I see him vulnerable, when I see her vulnerable, which means that they usually are not. it's always elements of surprise, of novelty, of unexpected, of the unknown in the midst.
So a couple listening right now, can they engineer those things to happen? Can they put themselves in situations where they see that in each other go on?
At any moment, at any
okay.
moment. But you have to be comfortable. If when you say, if I know your radiance, for example, is you're going to the studio to interview me. And when you are interviewing your people, now, if you leave.
She's watching right now.
And I say to you, have a fabulous time. You're going to be great. You're at your best there. I am talking about you. I am completely not in it with you. I'm just admiring, cherishing you, adoring it, encouraging you. But it's a separate you. If when you say I'm going to the studio and I say, again, why? Twice a week now you're going to do it? You didn't have enough when you were just doing one? You really don't want to be here, isn't it? You would rather be with all these people than with me, isn't it? It's a very different departure and a different relationship and a different tension. Because the person who leaves with somebody who says to them, go for it, have a fabulous time, enjoy, goes, experiences the erotic, as in they feel alive, they're in their passion, they're doing the thing they want to do. Here you are doing this thing that's your new endeavor, and you're really excited about it. And then you want to go home and talk about it. But the person who leaves because somebody just said, you're abandoning me again, obviously everything is more interesting than me. Why am I not enough for you? And all of that isn't really eager to come home afterwards because it starts to feel suffocating.
So you can actually engineer your own happiness by encouraging your mate to go do these things and be the best them because you'll be attracted to that.
And they will be attracted back to you. Who doesn't want to come back to someone who gives them freedom, who not just gives them freedom, but encourages their freedom? You want to come back because we need both. We need freedom and we need security. But when we are in the presence of people that open up the space for us, we want to come back to them. When we are with people who want to hone us in, we want to break out.